This is Paul. I hadn't really seen this before. I was reading this law dictionary. Yes. And they have a word called obligation. Something a person is bound to do or bound not to do, a moral or legal duty. Penalties may be imposed upon people who fail in their obligations. Now, what's interesting is, it lists all these different types of obligations. Let's see also obligation, absolute obligation, conditional obligation, conjunctive obligation, contractual obligation, express obligation, implied obligation, joint obligation, moral obligation, perfect obligation, personal obligation, primary obligation, principal obligation, pure, and obligation secondary. Now, usually when you read a definition in this law dictionary, it'll say, oh, see this, maybe one or two other entries in the dictionary itself, but it's like, see obligation, there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 different types of obligations. Yes! Now, when you think about obligation absolute, without obligations that must be met exactly according to an agreement, right? Then there's obligation conditional, obligation conjunctive, several connected parts, and then there's obligation contractual. Obligation express, an obligation which a person is bound by express terms to carry out a certain promise. Yes. Obligation implied, an obligation that is inferred to be a duty by the nature of the agreement. Such obligation can be upheld by law. Obligation joint, an obligation which two or more people bind themselves to perform an obligation. Then there's an obligation moral, a duty that should be carried out as a matter of conscience. However, a moral obligation cannot be enforced by law. Then there's obligation perfect, an obligation that can be upheld by existing law and legal right. Obligation personal, an obligation that an individual binds himself personally to fulfill, being solely liable to carry it out. And then there's the obligation primary, an obligation that is a primary reason for an agreement or contract. And then the obligation principal, the main obligation. And then there's the obligation pure, an obligation that has no conditions attached to it. And then the obligation secondary. Obligation that is to be fulfilled if a principal obligation cannot be fulfilled. Then there's the obligee, an individual to whom an obligation is owed. Then the obligor, an individual who binds himself to perform an obligation. Now, I would be considered an obligee, an obligee. Now, what's really funny is, let's say I email those in law enforcement. Yes, they have a sworn duty to enforce the laws of the United States. Now, an obligation perfect, an obligation that can be upheld by existing law and legal right. Now, as an obligee, I can sue every obligor, an individual binds himself to perform an obligation, for not enforcing my constitutional rights. There's a sworn duty to support and defend the Constitution. Now, as the obligee, the individual whom an obligation is owed, and the obligation perfect is an obligation that can be upheld by existing law and legal right. I have the legal right to due process. Now, let's say I get to suing today. I sue all of those that are elected or appointed to office as an obligee. You are obligated to enforce the laws of the United States. And I spent some time going through that no contact order where there's no signature of the petitioner. Right. There's a moral obligation to do what the law requires. Did you want to enforce the laws today?